In the early hours of September 20th, 1941, 20 Soviet tanks rumbled through the darkness toward Romanian positions outside Odessa. The Romanian soldiers heard them first, an ungodly mechanical screaming, like metal tearing itself apart. The ground shook. Through the dim moonlight they saw hulking shapes approaching, angular and monstrous. Their engines howling like tortured beasts. The Romanians broke and ran. 4 to 5 kilometers they retreated, professional soldiers abandoning their trenches, their weapons, their artillery pieces, fleeing in absolute panic from an enemy they couldn't identify. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. Those weren't tanks. Not really. They were farm tractors. Civilian agricultural machines that 10 days earlier had been sitting idle in a factory yard, waiting to plow fields that would never be plowed. Workers had wrapped them in scrap metal, bolted on salvaged gun turrets, and sent them to war crewed by sailors who'd never driven a tank in their lives, and they worked, spectacularly. 2 days later, the commander of all Romanian forces, Marshal Ion Antonescu, sent a furious message to his Fourth Army. I demand all moral fortitude and energy. Are you afraid of tanks? Our entire front ran 4 to 5 kilometers only when 4 to 5 tanks appeared. Shame on such an army. But the Soviets had a name for these improvised war machines. They called them na-ispug, NI for short. The literal translation? For fright. Terror weapons. Psychological warfare on tracks. This is the story of the most desperate gamble in Soviet military history, when a besieged city turned farm equipment into instruments of war, and somehow, against all logic, it actually worked. But before we understand how farmers' tractors terrified professional soldiers, we need to go back to where it all began, to a city that was never supposed to survive, and the men and women who decided they'd rather build tanks from scratch than surrender. August 5th, 1941, the war was just 6 weeks old, and the Soviet Union was bleeding to death. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa had smashed through Soviet defenses like a sledgehammer through glass. 3 million German and Axis troops had surged across a 1,000-mile front, destroying entire Soviet armies, capturing millions of prisoners, seizing vast territories. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. Every day brought news of another disaster, another city surrounded, another army annihilated, and on that August morning, Romanian and German forces reached the outskirts of Odessa, the Soviet Union's fourth largest city and its most important Black Sea port. The city was a prize, a major naval base, a crucial supply hub, home to nearly 600,000 people. Losing it would be catastrophic. The problem was, Odessa was almost impossible to defend. The city sat on the southwestern edge of the Soviet Union, jutting out into German-controlled territory like an exposed thumb. The Southern Front, the main Soviet army in the region, had already been pushed back hundreds of kilometers. Odessa was cut off by land, surrounded on 3 sides with only the Black Sea at its back. Romanian forces, backed by German units, had 8 divisions converging on the city, over 100,000 troops with modern artillery, air support, and plenty of tanks. The Soviet defenders? They had roughly 34,000 soldiers at the start, a hodgepodge of regular army units, naval infantry, and local militia. And they had approximately 70 tanks, mostly outdated T-26 light tanks, T-37 amphibious tankettes, and a few BT fast tanks. Not nearly enough. Colonel Nikolai Krylov, who served as chief of staff for the defense, later wrote in his memoirs that everyone knew the situation was hopeless. The only question was how long they could hold out before evacuation became necessary. But here's what nobody expected. The people of Odessa refused to give up, while the Axis forces prepared their assault. Something extraordinary was happening inside the city. 20 factories, most of them civilian enterprises that had never produced military equipment, began frantically improvising weapons. Machine shops started making mortar shells. Furniture factories converted to producing rifle stocks. A soda water bottling plant began manufacturing flamethrowers out of beverage cylinders, and at the center of this desperate industrial mobilization stood the January Uprising mechanical plant, the largest factory in Odessa. Before the war, it had produced agricultural equipment, industrial machinery, civilian goods. When Barbarossa began, the factory had been ordered to evacuate to ship its heavy machinery east, away from the advancing enemy. They'd followed orders. Almost all the critical equipment was gone, loaded onto trains and sent to safety. What remained was a shell massive building with some basic tools, a skeleton crew of workers and not much else, but they still had power. They still had welding equipment. And they still had something else. 3 STZ-5 tractors sitting in the yard. The STZ-5 was a Soviet agricultural workhorse, a track tractor, designed to pull plows and harvest combines across the vast collective farms of Ukraine. It had been in production since 1937 at the Stalingrad tractor factory. The machine was simple, reliable, and completely unsuited for warfare. It had a 4-cylinder petrol engine producing about 50 horsepower, could manage maybe 25 kilometers per hour on good roads, and had zero armor whatsoever. Its job was pulling heavy loads through muddy fields. Not fighting tanks, but to the engineers at the January Uprising plant, those tractors looked like a solution to an impossible problem. The tank situation was getting worse by the day. Those 70 tanks Odessa started with, by mid-August, most of them were wrecked or severely damaged. The Romanians attacked, constantly probing assaults, artillery barrages, aerial bombardment. Soviet armor was getting chewed up in brutal engagements on the city's perimeter. Tanks would limp back from the front lines on broken tracks. Riddled with holes, turrets jammed, engines smoking, the January Uprising plant became the main repair depot. Damaged T-26s and BT tanks were loaded onto flatbed trucks and hauled back to the factory. The remaining workers, many of them women and teenagers, since most men had been conscripted, worked around the clock trying to patch up these vehicles and send them back into combat. But there's only so much you can repair. By late August, they'd run out of tanks to fix. That's when Captain U.G. Kogan had an idea that seemed completely insane. Kogan was an artillery instruments engineer from the naval base. Recently transferred to the Odessa Defense Area headquarters, he'd been watching the factory workers perform miracles with limited resources, welding armor plates onto trucks, building improvised armored cars, creating weapons out of scrap metal. And he started thinking, if we can't get real tanks, why don't we make our own? Not proper tanks, of course. They didn't have the facilities, the blueprints, the time, or the materials for that. But something that looked like a tank. Something that could move and shoot, and most importantly, something that could make the enemy think twice before attacking. He brought the idea to P.K. Romanov. The chief engineer of the January Uprising plant, Romanov was a practical man, a problem solver who'd spent decades building industrial machinery. He looked at the 3 STZ-5 tractors sitting unused in the yard and thought, maybe the concept was simple in theory, nightmarishly complicated in practice. Take an agricultural tractor. Build an armored box around it, hull and turret. Mount whatever weapons you can scavenge. Create something that at least resembles a tank dot, but how do you armor a tractor when you have no proper armor plate? They scrounged. Naval steel from the shipyard's thin plating used for non-critical ship components. Boilerplate from industrial equipment. They even used a sandwich construction technique steel, plates with layers of wood and rubber in between to absorb bullets and shrapnel. The resulting armor was maybe 10 to 20 millimeters thick, crude and improvised, but tests showed it could stop rifle bullets and shell fragments. And the turret? They needed something that could rotate and mount a weapon. But they had no facilities to manufacture tank turrets from scratch. This is where the brutal calculus of desperate warfare becomes clear. They started pulling turrets off destroyed Soviet tanks. Remember those T-26s being brought back for repair? Some of them were too damaged to save crew killed, hull destroyed, but turret intact. The workers began removing single-man turrets from wrecked T-26 model 1931 and 1932 tanks. One of them, from a T-26 model 1932, had originally mounted a 37 mm gun, but they removed the cannon and installed a DT machine gun instead. Why? Because they didn't have 37 mm ammunition? They had thousands of 7.62 mm rounds for machine guns. but almost no artillery shells. Think about what this says about their situation. They were so desperately short of resources that they downgraded firepower just to have something that could shoot. Other turrets came from T-37A amphibious tankettes. Some turrets they built entirely from scratch crude cylindrical structures with gun ports. Basic traverse mechanisms cobbled together from scavenged parts. And here's a detail that shows you how improvised this whole operation was. They had to commandeer a turning lathe from the city's tram workshop to machine the turret ring components. A tram workshop. They were literally raiding public transportation facilities for parts. Construction began on August 10th, working around the clock. The workers were building these vehicles by hand with minimal heavy machinery, welding the hull plates, mounting the suspension, installing the turrets. 3 prototypes, each slightly different because they were using whatever materials happened to be available. 10 days. That's how long it took to go from concept to working vehicle. On August 20th, 1941. The first 3 NI tanks were ready. The unveiling was captured on newsreel footage, grainy, black and white, but preserved. You can watch it today. The first NI rolls out of the factory doors under its own power, its engine producing this horrific rattling scream because the hastily welded armor plates are vibrating against the chassis. The sound is genuinely disturbing, nothing like a proper tank. More like industrial machinery tearing itself apart. Factory workers stand watching, many of them women in headscarves. Soviet naval officers, the men who would crew these machines, inspect the vehicle. One of them climbs into the turret, traverses it 360 degrees to demonstrate it works. The engine noise is deafening. Then they drive off, heading toward the front lines with workers shouting encouragement. On to Sevastopol! And here's what makes this moment so poignant. Everyone watching knew these weren't real tanks. The armor was improvised, barely adequate. The weapons were salvaged. The tank was built around a farm tractor. These vehicles were theatrical props as much as weapons, designed more to frighten the enemy than to legitimately fight them. But they were something. And something was infinitely better than nothing. Within days, the order came down. Build 70 more. The problem was, they couldn't actually build 70 more, not with the resources available. So they organized a production chain across 4 different factories. One facility stripped down STZ-5 tractors. Another cut and shaped the steel plates. The tram workshop manufactured turret components. And the January uprising plant handled final assembly, but they needed those 3 prototypes to prove the concept actually worked in combat. Senior Lieutenant Udanan, experienced officer, was given command of the 1st Tank Platoon. His crews were volunteers, sailors from the naval base, soldiers from regular army units, even some of the factory workers who knew how these machines operated. None of them had formal tank training. They learned by doing. Between August 28th and September 3rd, the exact date is unclear because record-keeping was chaotic during the siege. Those 3 NI tanks went into combat for the first time. The location was the southern sector near the village of Dalnik, where the 25th Chapiev Division was defending against Romanian attacks. The plan was simple. The NI tanks would support a counterattack, advancing with infantry toward Romanian trenches. What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations. The Romanians had never seen Soviet tanks in that sector. Their intelligence had reported that Odessa's armor was destroyed or tied up on other parts of the front. So when these strange, angular, horrifically loud machines came rumbling out of the darkness toward their positions, the Romanian soldiers panicked. They broke and ran. Not a tactical withdrawal, a rout. 4 to 5 kilometers they retreated, abandoning their trenches, leaving equipment behind, fleeing in disorder. Colonel Krylov later wrote, "The results of the first battle were remarkable. The Romanians in the southern sector had never seen any Soviet tanks there before, and as a result retreated from their trenches by miles. The 3 NI tanks returned to the factory unharmed. Well, mostly unharmed. One had been hit by a 45mm shell that punched clean through the improvised armor but miraculously missed the crew and the engine. The stratified armor construction, those layers of steel, wood, and rubber had deformed and absorbed enough energy to save the vehicle. General Petrov, commanding the division, immediately requested more NI tanks. The Odessa Defense Area Military Council approved the production order, 70 more vehicles. As fast as possible, the NI had proven its worth not through superior firepower or protection, but through something more primal: fear. But production was agonizingly slow, even with 4 factories organized into a production chain. Building these vehicles was incredibly labor-intensive. Every hull had to be hand-welded. Every turret required custom fitting. They were constantly running out of materials: naval steel, turret rings, even basic fasteners, and the turret shortage became critical. They only had so many salvaged turrets from wrecked tanks. Many NI vehicles wound up with crude, improvised turrets, cylindrical structures with simple gun ports. Some photographs taken after Odessa fell show NI tanks with no turrets at all, just the armored hull and a machine gun port. Did they send turretless tanks into combat? Possibly. When the city is surrounded and the enemy is attacking daily, you send what you have. The bombing made everything worse. Romanian and German aircraft hit Odessa constantly. In late September, they bombed the tram workshop, the facility that was making turret components. Production probably slowed or stopped entirely after that. But by early September, Yuden's command had grown from 3 tanks to 35 vehicles, a full battalion. Most were NI tanks with maybe half a dozen real T-26s mixed in. The crews trained on the job, learning how to maneuver these slow, ungainly machines, how to work the turrets, how to fire from a moving vehicle, and they kept going into combat. Counterattacks, defensive operations, raids on Romanian positions. The NI battalion became a crucial mobile reserve rush to whichever part of the front was under pressure. Colonel Krylov noted, wherever there were a few tanks, the men went into the counterattack with confidence. Think about that. The presence of even a handful of improvised tractor tanks was enough to boost infantry morale, to make soldiers believe they could push back against a numerically superior enemy. September 20th, 1941, the night that would become legend. By this point in the siege, Odessa had been surrounded for 6 weeks. The Romanians had tried repeatedly to break through Soviet defenses, throwing wave after wave of infantry and artillery against prepared positions. They'd made minimal progress. The Soviet defenders were dug in, fighting with desperate determination, and the NI tanks had become a genuine psychological weapon. That night, the Soviets planned a major counterattack near Bolshoi Dalnik, the same sector where the NI had made its combat debut. This time the scale was larger. 20 NI tanks, formed into multiple platoons, would lead a night assault on Romanian positions. Night attacks were risky, coordination was difficult. Units could get lost, friendly fire was a constant danger. But darkness also offered advantages. It concealed troop movements, amplified confusion, and made those NI tanks even more terrifying. Picture this from the Romanian perspective. You're in a trench outside Odessa. It's after midnight, pitch dark except for occasional flares. You've been fighting for weeks against an enemy that refuses to surrender, and you're tired, stressed, running low on supplies. Your officers keep promising that the city will fall any day now. But any day keeps not happening. Then you hear something, a mechanical screaming, distant at first but getting louder. Not the smooth rumble of tank engines, something harsh, grating, wrong. Like metal shrieking against metal. The ground begins to vibrate. Flares go up, and in their flickering light you see shapes, angular, massive, moving toward you through the darkness. How many? You can't tell. Could be 5? Could be 20. Could be 50. Your unit has no anti-tank weapons in position. No artillery support. No air cover at night. And these tanks, whatever they are, coming straight at your trench, what do? 20 Romanian infantry positions broke simultaneously. Soldiers abandoned their trenches and fled into the night. The NI tanks, crews mowing down anyone who didn't run fast enough with machine gun fire, rolled straight through the defensive line and into the rear areas. And here's where the story gets even wilder. They kept going. The infantry couldn't keep up. Yuden's battalion was moving faster than the foot soldiers could follow, so they just continued the attack on their own. They reached Romanian artillery positions, guns set up behind the lines. Crews utterly unprepared for tanks. Suddenly appearing in their midst, the NI tanks did something brilliant. Instead of just destroying the artillery pieces, they captured them. Remember, these were tractors built for towing heavy loads. The tank crews hooked Romanian field guns to their vehicles and dragged them back towards Soviet lines like farmers, retrieving equipment from a field. By the time they returned, Udin's battalion had captured 24 artillery pieces of various calibers, plus dozens of mortar and machine guns, all towed back behind the NI tanks like trophies, Krylov later wrote. The tanks built in besieged Odessa inflicted on the enemy the heaviest losses since the first time they had been committed to action. Thus the tankmen brought back with them 24 guns of various calibers, and as many mortar and machine guns as they could fasten to their tanks. The cost? 6 or 7 NI tanks damaged by artillery fire or mechanical breakdowns. Most crews were rescued by other tanks. One man was Law Senior Political Instructor Mozalevsky. The battalion commissar. The September 20th raid became the high-water mark for the NI tanks. It was audacious, successful beyond reasonable expectations, and it humiliated the Romanian command so thoroughly that Marshal Antonescu sent his furious message about shame and cowardice. But here's the thing, the Romanians weren't actually cowards. They were professional soldiers fighting in terrible conditions against a determined enemy. They retreated because they believed they were facing a major armored assault, dozens of tanks supported by infantry and artillery. The psychological deception worked perfectly, but the siege was unsustainable. By late September, it was clear that Odessa couldn't hold out indefinitely. The southern front had collapsed. The German army group south was pushing toward Crimea and the Caucasus. Odessa was strategically isolated, tying down Soviet troops that were desperately needed elsewhere. On October 1st, Stalin himself made the decision: evacuate Odessa. The withdrawal was a masterpiece of military logistics, one of the few things the Soviets did brilliantly in the chaotic early months of the war. Over 2 weeks, the Black Sea Fleet evacuated approximately 86,000 troops, 15,000 civilians, vast amounts of military equipment, and even some factory machinery. The Romanians didn't even realize what was happening until the evacuation was nearly complete, but the NI tanks couldn't be evacuated. They were too large, too heavy, and frankly, not valuable enough to justify the transport space. Real T-26 and BT tanks got priority for evacuation. The improvised tractor tanks stayed behind. On October 16, 1941, the last Soviet forces left Odessa. Romanian troops entered the city and found the NI tanks abandoned, some in the streets, some in factory yards, most with their fuel tanks drained and weapons removed. Romanian soldiers posed for photographs next to these strange, improvised vehicles, trying to understand what exactly they'd been fighting against. According to Romanian records, they captured 68 NI tanks out of approximately 69 built. One must have been destroyed or evacuated. For a while, the Romanian army kept some NI tanks, possibly using them for training or demonstrations. But by mid-1942, they'd all been scrapped. The armor was too thin, the designs too improvised, the military value too limited. They were melted down for scrap metal. Not a single NI tank survived the war. Every one of them was destroyed or dismantled. All that remains are a handful of photographs, some grainy newsreel footage, and the memories recorded in veterans' memoirs. Senior Lieutenant Udin, the officer who commanded the NI tank battalion, survived the war. What happened to him after Odessa's evacuation isn't well documented, but he lived to see victory in 1945. Captain Kogan, the artillery engineer who came up with the idea, also survived. After Odessa, he continued serving in the Red Army, applying the same innovative thinking to other desperate situations. P.K. Romanov, the chief engineer who figured out how to turn tractors into tanks with minimal tools, kept working throughout the war, improvising and adapting as the industrial situation improved. Colonel Nikolai Krylov, whose memoirs provide most of our detailed information about the NI tanks, went on to become a Marshal of the Soviet Union, one of the highest ranks in the military. He commanded armies during major operations, planned strategic campaigns, and after the war he wrote extensively about his experiences, ensuring the story of Odessa's defense wouldn't be forgotten. But what about the workers, the men and women who built these machines with their own hands? Most of their names are lost to history. We know they were there, we know what they accomplished, but the documentary record doesn't preserve individual identities of factory workers, especially in wartime chaos. They likely evacuated with the city or joined partisan resistance units. Some probably didn't survive the war. The Axis occupation of Odessa was brutal mass executions, deportations, systematic violence against civilians. The city suffered terribly until Soviet forces liberated it in 1944. The siege of Odessa officially lasted 73 days from August 5th to October 16, 1941. In that time, Romanian and German forces threw 8 divisions against the city, suffered tens of thousands of casualties, and achieved a Pyrrhic victory. They captured a city, yes, but the Soviet defenders had tied down Axis forces desperately needed elsewhere, delayed the advance toward Crimea, and evacuated most of their troops to fight another day. And the NI tanks? They'd played a crucial role, not through military effectiveness, but through sheer audacity and psychological impact. Did they actually change the course of the siege? Probably not. Odessa was always going to fall, eventually surrounded, cut off, outnumbered. But the NI tanks gave the defenders something precious: hope and time. Hope that ingenuity could overcome resource shortages, that ordinary people, factory workers, sailors, engineers could improvise solutions that professional military planners had never considered, that creativity and determination mattered as much as superior firepower and time. Every day the NI tanks terrified Romanian soldiers into retreating was another day the defenders held out, another day for evacuation preparations, another day for Soviet forces elsewhere to regroup and prepare defensive lines. The strategic value of the Odessa defense became clear months later. Soviet resistance at Odessa and Sevastopol delayed the German advance through southern Ukraine by weeks, crucial weeks that pushed Hitler's timetable back. That meant his armies would hit the Russian winter unprepared. That contributed to the disasters at Moscow and Stalingrad. One historian calculated that the 73-day defense of Odessa and the subsequent 9-month defense of Sevastopol tied down Axis forces equivalent to an entire army group forces that could have been used to capture Moscow or Leningrad or the Caucasus oil fields. The NI tanks were a tiny part of that larger story, but they symbolized something important. The Soviet Union's greatest strength in World War II wasn't its tanks or its artillery or its air force. Those were all critically important, but what really mattered was the ability to endure catastrophic losses and keep fighting, to improvise solutions in impossible situations, to turn civilian industries into war production, to mobilize ordinary people into doing extraordinary things. When factories can become arsenals and farm tractors can become tanks, you're fighting an enemy that's very, very difficult to defeat. After the war, the Soviet Union built several replica NI tanks for museums and memorials. None of them are particularly accurate. They usually feature the wrong turrets, incorrect dimensions, and details that don't match the photographic evidence. But accuracy wasn't really the point. The NI tank had become a symbol, a story of resistance and innovation that embodied the spirit of Soviet wartime resilience. 2. Films featured NI tanks as plot elements: The Train to the Distant August in 1971 and Feet of Odessa in 1986. Both took dramatic liberties with history, showing workers writing slogans like "Death to Fascism" on the hulls in chalk, depicting the first tanks being pulled from the factory with ropes because they were too crude to drive. These details are almost certainly fictional, drawn from cinematic imagination rather than documentary record. But again, the truth is dramatic enough without embellishment. The real story is this: in August 1941, when the Soviet Union was reeling from catastrophic defeats, When entire armies were being destroyed, when the Nazi invasion seemed unstoppable, workers in a besieged city looked at farm tractors and scrap metal and said, "We can make something from this," and they did. They built approximately 69 improvised fighting vehicles in less than 2 months, using minimal equipment under constant bombardment with most of the skilled workers already conscripted into the army. They sent these machines into combat crewed by sailors and volunteers who learned tank operation on the job. And those machines crewed improvised, barely functional, terrified professional soldiers into retreat. There's a larger lesson here about technology and warfare. We tend to think of military capability in terms of specifications, armor thickness, gun caliber, engine horsepower, maximum speed. The NI tank was inferior in every measurable category compared to real tanks. Its armor couldn't stop artillery shells. Its weapons were scavenged and underpowered. It was slow, loud, mechanically unreliable, and built around agricultural machinery, but it worked. Not because it was good, but because warfare isn't just about specifications. It's about morale, psychology, surprise, and context. The NI tanks worked because Romanian soldiers didn't know they were fake, because darkness and noise made them seem more threatening than they were, because the mere presence of armored vehicles changed infantry behavior. Modern military theorists call this asymmetric warfare, using unconventional approaches to offset an enemy's advantages. The NI tank might be the purest example ever created, weaponizing agricultural equipment not for its combat power, but for its psychological impact. And here's what makes the story relevant today. Every major conflict since World War II has featured improvised fighting vehicles. Technicals in African wars pickup trucks with heavy machine guns, ISIS fighters welding armor plates onto civilian vehicles, Ukrainian forces converting civilian trucks into rocket artillery platforms. The fundamental concept pioneered by those Odessa factory workers in 1941, turning civilian machines into weapons when proper military equipment isn't available, has become a permanent feature of modern warfare. The next time you see footage of an improvised fighting vehicle from some contemporary conflict, remember, this tradition started with Soviet engineers looking at farm tractors and deciding they could be something else. The weapons have changed, the conflicts have changed, but the underlying principle remains the same. When people are desperate enough and creative enough, anything can become a weapon. The 3 STZ-5 tractors that became the first NI tanks rolled out of the January Uprising factory on August 20, 1941, making a noise that sounded like industrial machinery tearing itself apart. They drove toward the front lines crewed by volunteers who'd never trained in tanks, armed with weapons salvaged from destroyed vehicles. Protected by armor plates that couldn't withstand serious hits, they were cobbled together nonsense, frankly. Military suicide. Everyone knew it, but when Romanian soldiers heard that terrible mechanical screaming in the darkness and saw those angular shapes emerging from the night, they ran. And in that moment of panic and retreat, the NI tanks justified their name, Na Ispug, for fright. They were never meant to fight tanks. They were meant to frighten soldiers, and for 73 desperate days they did exactly that.